Hello, my name is Carolyn Carley, and this is my final project for IAH 204. My project is regarding how Japan got the world to forget its war crimes. First off, what is a war crime? War crimes contain two elements: a contextual element, the conduct took place in context and was associated with an international/non-international conflict, and a mental element, the intent and knowledge with regards to the individual act and the contextual element. Please pause if you would like to read what war crimes are defined by the UN. Please keep those in mind as we go forward. We're just move me down here. Okay. Who is protected underneath the Geneva Convention? In international conflicts, wounded or sick members of military forces in field and at sea, prisoners of war, and civilians are protected. In non-international conflicts, persons taking no active part in the hostilities, including surrendered members of the armed forces and those placed hors de combat by sickness, wounds, detention, or any other cause. And in both international and non-international cases, medical personnel, religious personnel, humanitarian workers, and civil defense staff are all protected underneath the Geneva Convention. So in order to get to how Japan got the world to forget its war crimes, we also have to look at Japan's war crimes. I'm going to warn in advance, this is a very graphic part of the presentation, so please do be warned. The Japanese Imperial Army committed many atrocities in the Chinese city of Nanjing. Among them included the killing of Chinese soldiers who had surrendered and laid down their weapons, the mass rape of over 20,000 women, including elderly and children, mass killing of civilians. Imperial Army officers encouraged their soldiers to loot, rape, and murder the citizens of Nanjing. Citizens were buried alive, shot, used for bayonet practice, and some had gas poured on them and burned alive. And as we can see a picture here, some of the bodies from Nanjing. Bangka Island Massacre. The Japanese sunk a civilian boat, the Werner Brook, and the survivors, including 60 British Australian soldiers and 22 Australian nurses, came ashore, Bangka Island, and they went to go look for Japanese soldiers because they expected to be treated humanely as they were not hostile. When Japanese soldiers were brought back to the survivors, they took the soldiers away from the women, killed them, and then came back to the women, made the women walk out into the sea up to their waists, and then killed them. And picture here is all 22 nurses. The Bataan Death March. Japanese soldiers were forced surrendered American and Filipino soldiers to march 100 miles in extremely hot temperatures to the prison camp that they were going to be held in. Prisoners were killed if they possessed any Japanese equipment, including any souvenirs, and they were killed if they collapsed and they couldn't move on unless their comrades could carry them, which was highly unlikely because their comrades were also starved, dehydrated, and extremely weak from the brutal treatment. They were denied food and water despite there being enough to go around, and they were randomly beaten by Japanese Imperial Army soldiers. Roughly 650 Americans and 5,000 to 10,000 Filipino soldiers were killed in the Bataan Death March. Some of the most graphic things that happened at the hand of the Japanese Imperial Army was the Unit 731 human experiments. Special Japanese military units, including Unit 731, conducted experiments on civilians and prisoners of war in China. Victims were subjected to experiments including, but not limited to, vivisection, amputations without anesthesia, testing of biological weapons, horse blood transfusions, injection of animal blood into their corpses, and much more. No anesthesia was used for these experiments because it was believed that anesthesia would affect the results of the experiments. And a quote I gathered from Wikipedia. Army engineer Hisato Yoshimura conducted experiments by taking captives outside, dipping various appendages into water of varying temperatures, and allowing the limb to freeze. Once frozen, Yoshimura would strike their affected limbs with a short stick, emitting a sound resembling that which a board gives when it is struck. Ice was then chipped away, with the affected area being subjected to various treatments, such as being doused in water, exposed to heat of fire, and much more. And as we can see, a picture here of someone's hands who had been put through that treatment. The Japanese Imperial Army created and controlled the system of sexual slavery that we now know as comfort women. It is the largest case of state-sponsored human trafficking and sexual slavery in modern history. Women, including girls as young as age 12, were forced into sexual slavery to please Japanese soldiers and anyone willing to pay. The women came from many nations, including China, Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, East Timor, and the Dutch Indies. And also some European women who happened to be in Japanese occupied territories were also forced to be comfort women. Pictured here is some liberated Korean comfort women. And pictured here is a line of Japanese soldiers waiting to receive services from comfort women. Multiple historical accounts show that Japanese soldiers committed cannibalism. Lord Russell of Liverpool cites examples of Allied prisoners of war being murdered and portions of their bodies served at dinner parties attended by senior Imperial Army officers. Captured American pilots were more likely to be murdered, and the eating of their flesh was that of a festive occasion. An Indian prisoner of war, Habidar Ram, testified that the Kempeitai beheaded an Allied pilot. He saw this from behind the trees and watched as the Japanese soldiers cut flesh from his arms, legs, hips, buttocks, and carried it off to their quarters. They cut it into small pieces and fried it. And this was not out of starvation. They had rice, which of course isn't incredibly all nutritious, but it wasn't a last resort. Now, how did Japan get the world to forget? At the end of World War II, Japan faced hard times economically. Unemployment was high and the industry was destroyed as the country was destroyed itself. In order to reform the country, the United States occupied Japan to put in place government and economic reforms they saw fit. 3 big reforms were the basis of Japan's economic miracle. The US got rid of the zaibatsu, which are large business conglomerates. They dissolved the zaibatsu by getting rid of the holding companies and selling their stock to the public. Arable land was taken from landlords and given directly to farmers who could till the land. Practices were improved for those who remained tenants of landlords on arable land. And the trade union law of 1945 gave the basic right to workers to organize, to bargain collectively, and to strike, much like what we have here in the United States. Right after America removed itself from Japan in preparation for the Korean War, recession was feared in Japan, but the Korean War actually increased world trade, which in turn increased Japan's production by 70%. The United Kingdom and the US also used Japan as a supply base for materials during the Korean War. And here we can see this very low trough being the end of World War II, and roughly around here is the Korean War, where we see a giant spike in GDP. After the Korean War, Japan enjoyed the boost in its economy. Japan imported lots of technology and improved upon it. They used innovations to mass produce cheap but quality goods. Japan began turning out cars and tons of electronics to export globally. And as pictured here is many appliances from the Mitsubishi Electronic Company. With their economy doing so well, many Japanese citizens had extra spending cash to spend on leisure and entertainment. And in 1964, Japan hosted the Summer Olympics in Tokyo, and they saw this as the perfect opportunity to reintroduce themselves to the world as a peace-loving nation. During the US's occupation of Japan, the American government brought over American films to combat Japanese propaganda shown during the war. Japanese filmmakers took inspiration from American films and ran with it. They produced action-filled movies with a distinct Japanese story with a Western format. They produced visually stunning works for the time, like the all-time classic Godzilla, which debuted in the United States in 1956. Nintendo, a Japanese game company, had its US debut in 1985 with the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES. Not too far previously, the US company Atari and its console flopped just before Nintendo introduced itself to the US market, so there was a perfect hole for Nintendo to fill. Within 3 years of the release, New York Times reported that the company had sold over 10 million systems in the US alone. And of course, you cannot talk about Japan without talking about one of its greatest cultural assets, anime and manga. Once the world got their taste of anime with Astro Boy in the 1960s, they were hooked. The art form specific to Japan became such a huge entertainment business and is now one of the biggest identifiers of the nation of Japan. Many older generations remember watching Astro Boy and being amazed, and then some slightly younger generations remember watching Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z on their Saturday morning cartoons. All these things accumulated contribute to Japan's soft power, which is the use of attraction and persuasion to change and influence behavior. Its sources include culture, political values, and global engagement, versus hard power, which is military force, payments, and economic sanctions, much like that of Imperial Japan. So it converted its hard power into soft power after World War II. But how do we avoid forgetting Japan's war crimes? Education. Many children in Japan are not actually taught what their country did. So they'll meet people from outside of Japan who complain about what Japan did during World War II, and they think they're just being whiny, but in reality, it's a very real grievance. So we need to continue to educate ourselves and also future generations to make sure we do not forget. We need to sympathize with the victims and their families and amplify their voices. It is not our job as people who have not experienced it, or nor our families of those who experienced it, to speak over those who are victims and family members of victims. We need to amplify their stories and hear and listen to them to learn. We also need to continue to hold the Japanese government responsible, but we should not use this as a basis to discriminate. We need to make sure that the Japanese government recognizes and apologizes for what it has done in the past, but we should not use this as a basis to discriminate against the Japanese people. And these are my sources. Let me move my little thing. And thank you so much for listening.